In recent days, we've been talking about different NHL drafts throughout the years, but this one was the last amateur draft because obviously, with the European factor more in play, very few Canadian and American teams were not scouting in Europe, and some of them were already pros for quite some time. Now, this amateur draft, the 16th annual, again, the last to be called an amateur draft, before the league created the modern entry draft in '79, was the first one before the merge. In addition, the drafting system had been in place for 9 seasons, made its final appearance in '78. A year later, the annual number of rounds would be predetermined, and teams would no longer be permitted to pass in rounds and then re enter as they had in the past. In addition, squads would no longer be purchased late round draft picks as they had from '69 to '78. Trades for draft picks after '78 would have to involve players or future non cash considerations. The '78 draft also marked the last time NHL teams had to compete with the upstart WHA in signing star junior players. Signs of the rival league's demise were already evident, and the first time since '73, the WHA did not draft a head-to-head competition with the NHL, and there was no WHA secret draft either. This enabled the NHL to take the draft out of the secrecy and required since '74 because they would draft players and WHA would mimic it. There was no longer need for the conference call format, and once again the draft became a public event at Montreal's Queen Elizabeth Hotel. Most importantly, the '78 draft would mark the final time in NHL history that underage players, those who did not turn 20 in their draft year, were ineligible. In '79, this would become the most dramatic and significant change in draft history, but in '78 it was still unmanageable. That's why under 20s in the WHA were still being drafted in '78. And while the '78 draft included many historic lasts, it also included historic firsts. The first time teams drafted players selected in the previous draft. Several '77 draft picks who were not offered contracts within a year had opted to re-enter the draft in '78. So this one, total players selected 234, 143 forwards, 67 defensemen, 24 goaltenders, 127 for major junior, 80 college players, 170 Canadian players taken, 47 U.S. citizens, 47 U.S. born, 17 European, 95 reached the NHL, 16 won the Stanley Cup, 1 Hall of Famer, 18 made an All-Star game, 1 made a year-end All-Star. There were 16 Olympians, and get this, 46 picks were traded. Now, as we go along, the struggling Cleveland franchise financial problems were a big issue as draft day neared. A year earlier, the Barons had saved themselves from folding, even though the uncertainty of their future had forced the NHL to delay its draft. In '78, the Barons weren't so lucky. The team folded, merging its remaining players and ownership group with Minnesota just a handful of days before the selections. That left the NHL with the question of how to handle Cleveland's scheduled '78 draft picks. The league decided to leave only the Barons' first 2 picks in play. The first rounder was moved to the last pick in the round, 18 overall, and then packaged into Cleveland, Minnesota dispersal draft. The Capitals, who had dispersal draft's number 1 pick, were given the option of selecting the first 2 former Cleveland players or using the number 1 draft pick vacated by Cleveland. Washington opted to pass in dispersal draft and take the draft pick instead. Meanwhile, the NHL allowed Cleveland's second-round pick to be used by Washington, which had obtained it from Cleveland in a trade. All of Cleveland's other draft picks were voided, and teams who had traded picks to Cleveland were also forbidden from using those picks. Now, it was a huge year for St. Louis, who set an individual team record with 31 picks in 1978, breaking the previous mark of 27 by Montreal in '77. The Blues achieved this total by purchasing late-round picks from several other teams. St. Louis's record is likely to stand for all time, since the total number of rounds has been restricted ever since the '78 draft, and is now virtually impossible for one team to accumulate 31 selections in a single draft, even though the Montreal Canadiens have made a lot of trades in recent years. Now, on the other hand, Pittsburgh drafted only 3 players in '78, the smallest total by an actively drafting team since the first true universal draft in '69. Overall, the final total of 234 was the second highest in NHL history to that point in time, despite the loss of the Cleveland franchise, and represented an increase of 49 players over '77. In one particularly comic moment near the end of the draft, Montreal GM Sam Pollock attempted to make a 16-round pick before he realized that Detroit was still drafting and had to pick ahead of his. Pollock went ahead and announced the name of St. Louis defenseman Brian Crowley. Detroit's officials had argued that he had to pick ahead of Montreal, and as a result, they quickly chose Crawley with their 16th pick just to stick it to the Habs. Ironically, the only future Hall of Famer drafted in '78 didn't reach the NHL for 11 years. Russian hockey legend Vyacheslav Fedosov, picked in the late rounds by Montreal, finally came to North America in '89, but never played for the first team that drafted him. While '78 wasn't a great draft for Hall of Famers, it was a memorable year for many other groups. The biggest winners were Americans, Europeans, and college players, who were all drafted in a record numbers. Now, very interesting situation. I'm going to go over the St. Louis picks, and you tell me if they're household names in their own household. You got Babbage, Harrison, Willison, Nill, Stockman, McLean, Ull, Mahar, Simpson, Lockhart, Froze, Lurge, Siltonen, actually Risto Siltonen was drafted, Hermanson, Boutin, Sullivan, Menard, Boyd, Stasiak, Tronchika, Schrick Duke, Bloomberg, Kitching, O'Connor, Mike Crombeen, Pigeon, Cochran, Casey, Farrell, Johnson, and Wheeler. And most of these picks came in the later rounds. In round 13, they took 6 players. In round 14, they took 5 players. Now, for those out there that are probably wondering, and all 15 of you, the Toronto, Quenneville, Curtin, and Parra, Douglas, Hewitt, Lefebvre, Schammel, Reinhardt, Waghorn, and Coulivier. And for Montreal, again, not too bad of a draft. Jeffion, Hunter, Yakochuk, who never made it to the NHL, Carter, David, Reeves, Boyd, Acton, a late pick, Lawson, Landon, Constantine, the former future coach, Swan, Metivier, Fedosov, Mars, Tignanelli, Goulakis, Moody, LeBlanc, Magnuson, Chrissy Allen, 231st overall, Wilson, Louis Schlegel, my distant cousin who made the NHL as part of the Quebec Goons of the 80s, and Rob. Now, talking about Louis Schlegel, again, Schlegel misspelled, as we like to say. Now, the traded picks was very interesting, and we'll go over this very quickly. The big deal, of course, was how Ben Wilson came to be drafted by Philadelphia. Pittsburgh, in a big trade, got Tom Bladen, Ross Lonsberry, and Horst Kinderchuk. Philadelphia also got future considerations at number 78, number 8. Now, Kenny Linseman got it from the Rangers, the pick from the Rangers, the rights to hire head coach Fred Chiro. So that was part of the deal. Now, number 8, Montreal had traded Glenn Goldup in their number 3, and they later traded. Montreal also got number 77, number 3, which was Mo Robinson. Now, in the Detroit deal, Toronto got Diane Maloney and a number 2 for 1980, Craig Muni. Detroit also got Errol Thompson, Al Jensen, and Mike Blaisdell in the draft. Now, Toronto getting Joel Quenneville. When St. Louis signed Rod Sealing as a restricted free agent, Toronto received this pick in cash from St. Louis as compensation. Now, to Steve Kristoff from Colorado. Colorado got rights to Henry Bouchard, who was playing in the WHA at the time, and this was in 1975, 3 years before. Merlin Malinowski was drafted by Colorado in the Dave Schultz deal, and Dale Yakochuk deal, quite interesting. Atlanta got a 73 number 1, Drew California, Tom Loziak, a 73 number 1, Vic Mercedes, and a 73 number 2 from Atlanta, Eric Vale. Montreal also got a 1973 number 1, later traded, and a 77 number 1, which ended up being Mark Napier, dating back 4 years before. Now, the Dave Silk deal for the Rangers, it was a part of the Dunk Wilson trade, so Pittsburgh got sent off that. Now, the cash considerations were quite heavy. In round 9, St. Louis drafted Rick Simpson with cash to Pittsburgh. Bob Froze, again, the goalie, Pittsburgh got cash. Rick Berard, drafted by Philadelphia, Buffalo got cash. St. Louis, Dan Lurge, Boston got cash. 175th, Dan Hermanson, Pittsburgh got cash. Jean-François Boutin, St. Louis, Toronto got cash. Marc Berger, Buffalo got cash. And John Sullivan, through St. Louis, Boston got cash. Now, St. Louis again, 191. Pittsburgh got money for their draft pick. 197, Paul Stasiak, Toronto got cash. and Gerd Trushiska, True Boston got paid. Bloomberg, Kitching, O'Connor, Crombeen, and Pigeon, Pittsburgh, LA, Atlanta, Toronto, Boston were paid off. Now in the round 14, Joe Casey, Jim Farrell, Frank Johnson, and Blair Wheeler, Pittsburgh, LA, Atlanta, Toronto got cash. There was no indication how much they were paid. Now, last we're going to talk about the drafts by round. Very interesting first rounder. Bobby Smith and Ryan Walter ended up future Montreal Canadiens. So that was another draft, just like in the early 1980s, the Lemieux deal, where 5 of the 10 players picked in the top 10 ended up Montreal Canadiens, but not all were Montreal draftees. So you had St. Louis took Wayne Babbage, Bill Derlago, very underrated draft pick, Mike Gillis to Colorado, Ben Wilson and Ken Linseman to Philly, Danny Jaffiot, Boston, Montreal, number 8, Willie Huber, Detroit, number 9, Tim Higgins, Chicago, then Brad Marsh, Brent Peterson, Larry Playfair, Danny Lucas, Steve Tambellini, Al Secord, Dave Hunter, and Tim Coulis. So not too bad in the first round. And the majority of these, except for Ken Linseman, of course, Linseman was a WHA player, and he was eligible in that draft. So round 2, very quickly. The no WHA draftees that year. And again, Linseman being an underage player. Now, Linseman eventually ended up in Edmonton and Boston through the years. But what was kind of interesting here, ladies and gentlemen, Mike McDougall was drafted from the IHL, a U.S. Character for the Rangers. This where he was from Port Huron. He played with the AAA squad there in '74. Played Montreal DQ, ended up with the IHL for 2 seasons. Instead of he wasn't a pro, so he wasn't an underage player when he was drafted. So it's an interesting thing if you go on HockeyDrawCentral.com to see the machinations, especially St. Louis that year. I don't know what they were talking about, but the Raiders also took a player from the IHL, Milwaukee, 110th overall, after he had played in the AHL in Maine as well. So not too often you see someone playing minor pro eventually being drafted. And of course, Dan Eastman, who was playing with Saginaw in the IHL as a underage, not underage, but also an overrated underage player. And again, Rick Sirois, another IHL draft pick. Rich, very talented player. And don't forget, we also had players from the USFL at the time, USAHL at the time. So quite interesting. But with the later rounds, you're seeing a lot of NCAA. But again, IHL, there was a whole bunch of prospects who were taken in the later rounds and the USAHL as well. So ladies and gentlemen, that's the story. The very bizarre 78 draft. You had WHA players taken, minor pro players taken, Europeans taken. The only Hall of Famer, again, fed us off. And the situation of buying picks like that, St. Louis was on a spending spree. I don't know why, unless they were planning to make a farm team. If somebody is a St. Louis fan could tell me if that was just a plan to stock a farm team, let me know. I'd like to be interested to know what you know about that. Because I think St. Louis did have a farm team at the time, but maybe that was the plan. To get, as many, cost-efficient players to have that squad. Thanks for listening. Don't forget, give us a like, comment, subscribe, or share. And if you like what we're doing, tell your friends. If you don't like it, don't tell nobody. Have a good one. Bye.